And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What's up, guys? Nick Scripp here on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, reacting to the NFL free agency once again. I did a video earlier this week talking about the early moves, and then I was trying to tell people to go out and grab certain guys that have not been moved yet. And since then, most of those guys have been moved, but it's definitely been interesting so far. So, what I plan on doing here today is going through the list of guys that have moved so far, and then look forward here to guys that are still waiting to be moved. And we've had a lot of action this week. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of things to talk about. Going to try to whiz through. Had some technical difficulties, but I think I'm all good now. I think I'm all good. Trying to figure out how to share a screen, and I was getting denied by my own computer here. But if you are sticking with the podcast here, give me a quick minute and we'll get things going.
I play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win.
And as we kick things off, as always, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group. Head over to fantasypoints.com/subscribe. It's a one-stop shop for everything fantasy related you are looking for, regardless if you are a dynasty, redraft, DFS player. Everything you need is in one spot there. So, like I mentioned before, I had a show the other day talking about free agency moves and some of my thoughts. So I figured I have another one because a shit ton of other things started happening this week. So there's a lot to talk about. Guys I suggested going out and grabbing might be hard now just because they have new homes. But let's talk about a couple things. Starting here, and I have my my cool screen graphics. If you're listening to this in your car or something, you can always check it out on YouTube or Twitter later. First guy I want to mention, Diontae Foreman. Diontae Foreman was the backup turned starter on the Titans last season. He is now with the Panthers, which is interesting. You know, he earned a bag weeks 12 through 18. They had a bye week in week 13. He rushed for over 100 rushing yards in 3 out of 6 of his games that he was getting the primary touches, which is very impressive. One of those games, he had 132 rushing yards versus the Dolphins. He had a 19.2 fantasy week in that game. He also had 3 touchdowns in those 6 games. So he definitely earned himself some money. He got the looks from the Panthers here, which is interesting because I've seen a bunch of people talking about this. Does this mean that, you know, Carolina is just establishing a good backup? Does it mean that CMC potentially could be traded in a Deshaun Watson deal? That's another, you know, possibility that's been thrown out there. I'm not saying I believe any of these things, but things to talk about. You know, CMC has been very banged up the last 2 years. Is it going to be more of a committee approach? Is CMC going to line up in like the slot or something like that? I've seen a bunch of different takes on this. I think it's interesting. The bottom line is he's earned himself a role and on a team, and I think he's a guy you can probably stash for free. I'm not sure, you know, if a lot of guys hung on to him throughout the off season, but if he's floating out there, it says 70% on ESPN, but it might just be, you know, counting the redraft season. But if he's floating out there, might be a guy to stash for a potential role if something crazy happens in Carolina. James White back with the Patriots. What does that mean for the Patriots? You know, James White historically has been a guy who has been in the past very important to the Patriots. What I think his role is going to end up being now, though, is a guy that takes over the Brandon Bolden role. You know, Brandon Bolden this past season had a little bit of upside because he had 2 games with 6 catches, 2 games with 4 catches, then sporadic 1 to 3 catch weeks throughout the season. And that might be the same for James White because we know they have Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. Those 2 guys, I would assume, will get the bulk of touches in the backfield, with James White, again, just being that Brandon Bolden guy. Does that mean he has, you know, a ton of value for fantasy and PPR leagues? I'm going to say probably not, unless one of those 2 guys is out of the mix. If Damian Harris or Ramondre Stevenson is banged up, maybe he, gets some more time on the field, even though, neither one of those guys are like a profiled pass catching running back. We got Teddy Bridgewater. I'll just throw his picture on the screen here. Him and Tyrod Taylor both found new homes. Teddy Bridgewater with the Dolphins, Tyrod Taylor with the Giants. I saw some takes too saying, maybe Teddy takes over Tua's role. Highly doubt that. I think that bringing in two veterans for these young guys is good, and I think that they fit probably the playbook that's set up for both Tua with the Dolphins and then Tyrod Taylor, Daniel Jones with the Giants. Daniel Jones can be a little bit mobile at times. Teddy Bridgewater, good pocket passer, more of a Tua profiled sort of guy. So good veterans in the system. What I do want to shift over to, though, is the Dolphins backfield. So with the Dolphins, the initial signing was Chase Edmonds, and this brought back all of the Chase Edmonds stands. And I'm not trying to dig into anybody or, poke fun at those guys, but I'll say that with Chase Edmonds, we've seen in the past him have some pretty good PPR weeks. He profiles, again, as a pass-catching back. He had 12 appearances this past season. He had 4 games with 5+ catches, so that shows the way that he is typically used. He averaged 11.9 fantasy points. He had 6 games above that mark. For the rushing side of things, though, he averaged 49.33 rushing yards per game if we look at all the games he appeared in. If we take away the 1 week that he only had 1 carry, he'd be at 53.54. So not super sexy for his rushing upside. And I wrote this in my notes earlier. There's a good chance the Dolphins bring in someone else. I know a lot of people want so bad, especially when he was the lone guy at one point with the Cardinals, for him to be like Alvin Kamara and be this pass catching back that gets most of the work too. And I wrote in my notes, they're going to bring in somebody else. And they did. And we can, temper our expectations, I guess, with Raheem Mostert, but I think they bring him in with a purpose. If we look at Mostert, he was hurt week 1. He missed significant time in 2020. He opened up 2020 with 25.10 and then 18.7 fantasy points back-to-back of the first weeks last season, and then he got hurt, so it was a bit of a disappointment because he looked good. We know, next-gen stats, he ends up being on that list all the time for fastest plays. He's a very fast running back with a lot of explosiveness when he's healthy and on the field. 2019, 4 games, over 20 fantasy points, counting the whole season. He scored in every single game weeks 12 through 17 at the end of the season. So we know 2019, he went on a tear. He was scoring every single game. He had some nice weeks. 2020, he opened up the season well, but then he's had a bunch of injuries. I'm going to go on a limb and say that both of these guys get work. And I'm not going to say like Chase Edmonds' value is now, killed. I'm not going to say Chase Edmonds is completely safe either, though. I think it's probably a mix of both if Mostert is indeed playing it on the field, because I feel like both guys are going to be used. I think Chase Edmonds in the passing game primarily, and then Mostert probably in the red zone, in some early down work. So I can see both guys getting utilized. What does this mean for Myles Gaskin? He might get cut, to be honest, if we're going to be completely honest with that. But again, with Edmonds, probably not the best sign for them to bring in another running back. But maybe you look at it and say, hey, from a dynasty perspective, they could have brought in a Breece Hall or something like that. And, a young running back that's the future of the Dolphins. Raheem Mostert, with his injury history, doesn't, jump out and say, hey, this guy is going to take all the work away from Edmonds, but I'm sure he's going to have some sort of role. And J.D. McKissic's our next guy to talk about. He pretty much punked everybody today. What happened was J.D. McKissic, there was a notification that went off, and it said J.D. McKissic is now going to be a Buffalo Bill. And a lot of people were interested in this, right? J.D. McKissic, we know, has had PPR value in the past. I guess I can make these videos bigger here. We know he's been good in the past, and, as soon as that notification went off, all the Antonio Gibson truthers were, elated. They saw a world in Washington where they didn't have McKissic taking away Antonio Gibson, who was once a wide receiver's pass catching upside, right? And then later, everything changed. We got the notification that he's actually going to go back to Washington. I don't know if Washington came in late with an offer for McKissic. I don't know if they saw what the Bills put out there and said, hey, you know what, we want you back. I think for him, a lot of people ask, like, why would you want to go play with Carson Wentz throwing you the ball? Because, again, he's a pass-catching running back. But at the same, instead of Josh Allen. But at the same time, when he looks at the Buffalo Bills, I'm not going to say Devin Singletary and Zach Moss are like scary running backs to, fight time with. Devin Singletary was on fire this past season, sure. But I think he just knows his role with Washington. He knows his role with Rivera. He knows his role in that offense. If he goes to, Buffalo under the same sort of money deal, maybe he wasn't going to touch the ball as much. So, I mean, I kind of get it. I mean, obviously you want to go to Buffalo to maybe win a championship, play with a much better quarterback. But when you know what your role is with Washington across what has happened the last 2 seasons, then I guess it does make sense. So for PPR purposes, though, I picked him up in a smaller roster dynasty league. I mean, it wasn't like we only had 5 roster spots, but he was hanging out on the waiver wire. I know he was hurt at the end of the season, but he didn't play after week 12 this past year. But here's some of his PPR scoring weeks. Week 2, 20.3. Week 4, 16.9. Week 6, 19. Week 8, 17.3. Week 12, 22.6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks of having very, very good upside. 16 plus in all of those 5 weeks, with 2 of them being in the 20-point range. I think he should be rostered just because they've used him in that system plenty in the past. The last 2 seasons, a lot. He also had a bunch of games under 10 fantasy points, but at the same time, when you can have a guy in your roster for a running back position that's pretty thin to begin with, then I think it serves purpose for rostering. My show on Monday, I talked about DJ Chark a little bit already, and I said, he was a potential trade target for dynasty leagues. Maybe people still feel that way. Chark opened up the year good with Lawrence, a nice big game to start the year. He had injuries throughout the rest, I believe, with his ankle. 2020, he was the wide receiver 41. He played in 13 games. 2019 was the big year for him. In 14 games, he was the wide receiver 16 overall. He averaged 15.6 fantasy points. He had 7 games above that average. He had 3 games above 100 receiving yards, with 2 of them being 146 and 164 receiving yards. So we've seen DJ Chark in the past be good. The big thing is his injury history and him actually staying on the field. He's a 6'4" receiver with a history of big games. The big debate that everybody's been, talking about, I guess today was like redraft versus dynasty on the Twitter world. That's what people wanted to argue about, which is like goofy that people want to go on the internet and fucking argue with each other about topics instead of like, I don't know, just like talking about fantasy football and sharing thoughts and, dropping content, but to each their own with that. But the big debate Monday was like Chark's value, Amon-Ra St. Brown's value. Does it hurt his value? Does it not? This and that. At the end of the day, I think both guys could be flex plays if both are healthy. But at the end of the day, if we don't, understand that the targets are probably not going to be very, very solidified with either one of those guys, I think we're trying, to ignore the other side of the ball. So if you really think Chark's going to be the man, or if you really think Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be the man, I don't think either one of them is going to be the man on the team. TJ Hockenson, DeAndre Swift, we know that they're going to command some targets. I think both guys are just going to have flex weeks, personally. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, Amon-Ra St. Brown showed his talent this past season, but in the past we've seen DJ Chark ball out. So I just have a feeling that both guys are flex plays. I don't think either guy is going to end up being so much ahead of the other guy when completely healthy at the end of the day. That's my bland, I'm not digging into the data right now, take on the whole thing. So I talked about Russell Gage on the show on Monday. I said he was a potential trade target. I'm a little iffy about the situation now because he's on the Buccaneers with Tom Brady. The big question to me, so Russell Gage, I think, fills in for Chris Godwin's role until Chris Godwin comes back. What is that timeline specifically? I'm not entirely sure. Is it going to be 2 weeks of the season? Will it be half the season? I don't know. I do know that when he does fill in that role, I think he's going to have some upside, right? We've seen in the past Russell Gage have some really nice games, even this season, a couple games in the 20-point fantasy range, 18 points, week 12. I mean, we can go and shout out every week that he was good. But when he got some targets and some volume, he did produce, and he actually is a guy that can score. He doesn't look like this big Mike Evans body type guy, but he is a guy that gets looks in the red zone, and he has scored in the red zone the last 2 seasons with Matt Ryan. I think he's a good best ball player because some people beat me to that punch on Twitter, and shout out to those people that did, but I think he's a good best ball player, or a guy that is going to have some nice value early on, but then be kind of iffy throughout the season, just because let's say Gronk's back, let's say Mike Evans is there, let's say Chris Godwin is healthy. Like where is his targets going to be? Like what is his targets going to look like on a weekly basis? And Tom Brady likes to use the running back as well. Maybe Fournette is back, and we know that he had one of the highest average targets in the league this past season. So, what I wanted to dig into with Russell Gage was Antonio Brown. So Antonio Brown, and they're not similar talents at all, but it's just, the other piece of a puzzle that is no longer there. Now Russell Gage is there. But Antonio Brown played weeks 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 16, and 17. We'll take out week 6. If we take out, some of the weeks that these other guys were out, because let's say, Evans and Godwin were both out, like in week 16, they were both out. Obviously, Antonio Brown got a boost. So he was alone week 16 because Evans and Godwin were out. Gronk was out 4, 5, and 6. So let's look at the weeks that he played with Evans, Godwin, and Gronk. Week 1, he had 7 targets and a touchdown, 23.7 fantasy points. Week 2, 3 targets, 2.7 fantasy points. I think he might have gotten hurt in that game. Week 17, 5 targets for 5.6 fantasy points. So, we saw these big days out of Antonio Brown with 11 and 13 and 15 Tom Brady targets, which are better targets than if you go team to team. But, what is the true opportunity when Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Rob Gronkowski, if he is back, are all in the system for Russell Gage? Is he a potential flex? Is he a guy that we have to wait for somebody to be out of the picture? If Gronk doesn't come back, does that open up the door for him to get some more solidified volume? I just like my guys in fantasy to have predictable targets and predictable volume. And if he's floating somewhere between the 3rd and 4th option in this offense, it's not as good as I kind of wanted it to be for Russell Gage. But while Chris Godwin is out, I think he's going to have some nice value. And maybe, for dynasty leagues, you can bank on that value. He scores 16 plus fantasy points the first 3 weeks, and then Godwin's back, and then you sell him before Godwin takes a step on the field. It's kind of up for grabs when it comes to that. Got some comments. Check your DMs. Doing that. I think my timing's a little off to be doing that. We'll keep going through here. So Zay Jones. So Zay Jones on the Jags. The Jags, we talked about this on Monday. They ended up signing a bunch of slot receivers, which we all, poke fun at with Christian Kirk, and they added Evan Ingram, who might line up in that area of the field as well. And we know that Laviska Shenault also lines up in that area of the field. But Zay Jones, I talked about him on Monday. And he's a guy that, I mentioned after the bye week 8, he played in 75% of the snaps in 8 out of 10 of those games. And for the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, he averaged 14.5 fantasy points. So when Zay Jones actually had some opportunity with the Raiders filling in for Ruggs, he actually was pretty good in fantasy. And what I wonder is deeper leagues, is he going to have some value if he lines up out wide, and there's some weird system going on between Christian Kirk and Laviska Shenault and the tight end. I'm not sure. Again, Zay Jones, more of a deeper league guy. He does have the ability to have these bigger games, like I said, in the fantasy playoffs where he was scoring around almost 15 fantasy points per week. But figuring out what his role is going to be on the Jags is going to be interesting. So probably would have preferred him to go somewhere where they weren't signing a bunch of other guys. But to say that, he's so far behind Laviska Shenault and Christian Kirk that he won't, touch the ball, I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting. But it was funny because I called him out on Monday, and he ended up getting signed, like, I think 20 minutes after the podcast finished. I'll mention it briefly, but Tyler Conklin on the Jets, which is interesting because CJ Uzomah also is on the Jets. And I mentioned CJ Uzomah, probably a guy that's good for Zach Wilson as a red zone option, not a guy that's going to get a bunch of targets per game. Tyler Conklin actually handled some decent volume through the season. Back-to-back 7-target weeks, weeks 8 and 9, week 13, 9 targets, week 17, 9 targets. How this is going to play out between those two guys is interesting. I get every time there's two tight ends in a system together, two new tight ends, I get the Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith like nightmare going on. So I'm not super comfortable with either one of those guys, to be honest, as like guys I want to target in Dynasty or anything like that. OJ Howard, one of my all-time OG boys. I always have a soft spot for OJ Howard. He was just out of college as a freak athlete, and he actually was popping off in fantasy a handful of years ago, but then he had the Achilles tear, and with Tom Brady and the Buccaneers, he was obviously behind Rob Gronkowski and Cameron Brate. This past season only had one really decent fantasy week in week 6, 16.9 fantasy points, where he scored a touchdown at 7 targets. With the Buffalo Bills, what does that mean for the Bills? Dawson Knox having the year he did. Is OJ Howard a primary blocker? And, Knox is running more routes now than he did previously. Is it vice versa? I don't really, look at Dawson Knox and say, oh my gosh, he's like this elite pass blocker. But I wonder what sort of sets that OJ and Dawson are both going to line up in. But again, not something super, super sexy for fantasy. Got to talk about Deshaun Watson. As if nobody in the world has talked about this guy enough across the last month. So the teams, if we have to predict what it is, it keeps looking like it's going to be the Falcons. The Saints are in the picture still. I think that the Panthers probably are still fighting for a spot in the race for Deshaun Watson. What Deshaun Watson brings for fantasy, I mean, if we look at some of the finishes in the past, RB, quarterback 6 in 2020, quarterback 2 in 2019, quarterback 5 in 2018, just to go back a few years. The last time he played in the NFL, he had 33 passing touchdowns. We just know that wherever he goes, somebody's going to get a massive bump for fantasy, right? It's going to be the first thing people talk about. People won't talk about Deshaun Watson. The minute that he signs somewhere, everybody's going to quote tweet it and say, blah, 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 with the stocks pointing upward. So if it's the Falcons, obviously Kyle Pitts, with the hope that they bring in somebody else that can take some defensive pressure off of Kyle Pitts. If it's the Saints, Kamara and Thomas, right? We know that as long as Michael Thomas is still there and healthy. Panthers, DJ Moore, Christian McCaffrey, if he's still around. It's interesting because now, we don't just hear things about Watson, but we hear things about what would happen if he did go somewhere. If he did go to the Falcons, Matt Ryan's probably gone, right? If he went to the Saints, it probably means that like Jameis Winston won't go to the Saints. If he went to the Panthers, will it cost them like McCaffrey? There's just like a lot of moving pieces, which is a bit frustrating because I feel like we all want this to be done by now. But other ties that have happened with this have been Allen Robinson potentially being tied to Deshaun Watson, and wherever he goes, A-Rob's going to try to go. Will Fuller's been in that mix saying like, yeah, me too. So that's interesting as well. But we're still waiting on the Watson news. I feel like people are starting to look into the Vegas odds and seeing how things shift. He's the guy that we know is going to bring massive fantasy value wherever he lands. He can land pretty much anywhere and bring a lot of fantasy value. I think he's probably still, as of right now, without knowing anything, a top 5, a top 7 quarterback for fantasy without blinking. We know he's going to have a lot of upside in the passing game, and we've seen it consistently before. When I mentioned 2020, 2019, and 2018, he was top 6 in all of those seasons with a finish as high as 2 for fantasy. Matt Ryan, his name's being thrown around now too. Same with Baker, who I'll mention briefly afterwards. Matt Ryan, where's he going to end up? If it's not the Falcons, if Deshaun Watson is there, I doubt it's going to mean that he ends up going to the Texans. I don't think it's just going to be he's going to be a big part of this deal. They're probably not super interested in Matt Ryan, who's, not the youngest of guys. And they do have Davis Mills, who I'm not going to say is, better than Matt Ryan, but I don't think they want to take on Matt Ryan in his contract. So is there a chance that he goes to the Colts, to the Seahawks? And, he was inconsistent this past season. I mean, look at week 8, 6 fantasy points, week 9, 28 fantasy points, which translate to the NFL performance, obviously, with the yardage. If we look at that, under 150 and then almost at 350 the next game. So pretty inconsistent in Atlanta. It wasn't the best situation to be in with Calvin Ridley not there. Obviously, Julio Jones was gone. Patterson was like the glue holding this offense together. Kyle Pitts, a rookie, had a nice year. But I think Matt Ryan, if he does go to like a Colts or a Seahawks, I think you'd be happy with your DK Metcalf or your Michael Pittman Jr. stocks for Dynasty. I do, because I feel like it could be a lot worse. It can be a lot worse. It can be a developing rookie. It could be Drew Lock. I mean, it could be worse than Matt Ryan. Baker's another guy. So Baker pretty much wrote his goodbye farewell on Twitter. 2 long screenshots of his goodbyes and thanking Cleveland. So I think that they're done with him, and I think he's done with them. It's a mutual breakup. I don't think there's like this big discrepancy between it was them that wanted to cut ties versus it was him. I think they've just both hit that point of the road where it's over. It's over. And I guess he prefers the Colts. Do the Colts prefer Baker? And I know he's played injured, and my concern with him is always fantasy related, but my concern with him, I think, would be what his effect does to the pass catcher. So I mentioned Matt Ryan with DK Metcalf or Michael Pittman Jr. I trust that more than Baker. I do for the coming season or 2 seasons. With Baker, I think he's going to have some fire, under his belt. I think he's going to have a chip on his shoulder, but we've just seen him be pretty mediocre for fantasy. And in the NFL, he's been like, okay. We've seen some glimpses of him being pretty good. We've seen some glimpses of him being not so hot. He's another guy that's been in awful situations as far as like who he's throwing to. I think his team was like mostly operated by Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt adding on when he was available. But it'll be interesting to see where he goes in the domino effect. So going down this list, NFL free agents, I think I'm just going to pull this over. If I can grab my screen and slide it over. Getting better with the text stuff over here. You can see all my files. Probably need to delete stuff. But remaining guys on this list, looks like I got some potential spelling mistakes, and I'm going to disregard here on my Word document. Allen Robinson, is it going to be a prove-it deal somewhere? I made a joke. Christian Kirk kind of roughed up the market. So what does that mean for Allen Robinson? Is he going to kind of bite the bullet a little bit to pair up with a Deshaun Watson? Is he going to be on a deal that is a prove-it deal because he had an off year? I mean, he was pretty bad, but he also wasn't really used the right way in that system under Nagy in Chicago. So interesting to see where Allen Robinson goes. Leonard Fournette, I've been talking about enough on the podcast. I had an infographic about him the other day. The other day was actually this morning. about what he did in 2021, what he's done for fantasy in the past. Leonard Fournette is a big, big dynasty contender buy for me. I don't care where he goes. If he goes back to the Bucs, that is the icing on the cake for me because we know the connection of him with Tom Brady. If I think I have a shot at winning a ship in 2022, I'm going after Leonard Fournette because wherever he goes, he's going to touch the ball. But I think with Tom Brady back, they're going to try to bring as much of that team back as possible. Leonard Fournette and him had a good connection. That includes Rob Gronkowski on this list. Somebody asked earlier, is Rob Gronkowski just going to go to another team? I don't see that at all. I think it's either like hang it up or go back with Tom. I don't think that he's interested in like jumping ship and testing the waters with the Chargers or something like that. As much as like fantasy wants to see something like that, I think Gronk is just committed to his connection with Tom Brady. So I really think it's the Buccaneers or it's not. I think it's one of those two options. OBJ, I saw some ties saying that he may be re-signed with the Rams. Might be a respecting, might be a Matt Stafford thing. We know that he tore his ACL in the Super Bowl, which was unfortunate, but maybe it's a smaller deal to come back with the Rams. Pat Patterson from the Falcons this past season was a baller. I don't think they're going to re-sign him because I feel like they're shaping things for the future a little bit now. I think if Deshaun Watson comes, do they try to bring him back? Then maybe. I don't know, but he's still floating out there. Julio Jones is also floating out there now because he was released. I hope that we can get just a glimpse of old school Julio at some point this coming year, but I kind of bought into that last season. And it wasn't anything because he was not healthy. Jameis Winston, I think, is the quarterback that I mentioned on Monday that I thought was a major dynasty buy. And I said this earlier this morning, like we can sit around in our dynasty leagues and make no moves right now. But I feel like the longer you wait for guys to find a new home, the higher their price is going to be later, right? So if Jameis Winston ends up signing a deal tomorrow, his price tomorrow versus right now this second are two completely different things. So I was saying before in Superflex leagues, like go get him now. I think a guy like Marcus Mariota, right? I mentioned him before. It's 50-50 to me. Is he going to be a starter next year? Is he going to be a backup? I mean, it might not even be 50-50. But I think Jameis Winston has a very high chance of being an NFL starting quarterback next season. So, again, if you're in a dynasty league, you're watching this show, you're in front of your phone, and you need a quarterback, I think now is the time because, again, the price changes as the situation changes. Juju Smith-Schuster, still pretty interested in him. I got a bunch of notes that I think I copy and pasted in here. Mentioned a lot of these on Monday, but historically in the past, we saw a very high wide receiver finish for him in fantasy, obviously in 2018 when he had that 1,400 plus receiving yard season. He was the wide receiver 8. He was wide receiver 17 in 2020, which was like disappointing for some people, but actually wasn't too bad for fantasy. I guess maybe he was being drafted higher, but we've seen some good days out of Juju. He's still young. He had a good touchdown season with 9 in 2020. There's still a lot of teams that can really, really use Juju. I still think the Bills need a wide receiver. The Bears for sure need a wide receiver. I think that they should potentially look for one of these guys available, not named Allen Robinson. And I think Juju's a good option. I really do think Juju would be a good option for the Bears because Mooney is a good deep threat and very explosive. And I feel like Juju can operate across the slot. And then they got enough picks in this draft where I feel like they can address a younger wide receiver in the second because I don't think Daz Newsome is really an answer to anything. But Juju's still floating out there. Jarvis Landry, another guy with a chip on his shoulder. How much gas does he have left in the tank? I'm not sure, but he noted himself that he's barely been injured throughout his career, and this was like an asterisk year for him. Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon's really interesting because I feel like I feel like there's still teams out there where he can just hop in and see some touches right away. I mean, if we're going to go look down the list, Seattle, are they comfortable with Chris Carson coming back from that disc fusion? Are they going to bring back Rashad Penny? Rashad Penny's another guy just kind of floating out there right now. Is Saquon 100% back in New York? Are they going to try to, move on from him and have a filler with Melvin Gordon? Down the list, Jets. I know they brought Tevin Coleman back, but could Michael Carter be a 1A, 1B with Melvin Gordon and Michael Carter be more of the pass-catching running back in that system? Not sure. The Texans still need a running back. The Falcons still need a running back. So for Melvin Gordon, there's still possibilities where he can land somewhere and for sure be guaranteed touches. Could he stay with the Broncos? Maybe, but I thought reports were saying that it wasn't looking like that was going to be the case. But again, if Melvin Gordon goes to a shitty situation but is going to get 18 touches a game, that's fantasy value because he's a guy we've seen have plenty of good games in the past, and he has a track record. Marcus Mariota talked about a little bit. I think Jameis Winston finds a home before he does as far as a starter goes. He's still got Baker, got Matt Ryan as well that are looking to move on. Will Fuller is out there. Again, a guy that might have some ties to Deshaun Watson. We've seen Fuller good in the past. It was a weird injury season for him with like a finger. Jameson Crowder, veteran presence. Could he be an outlet for a quarterback in the short and intermediate range for one of those teams that I mentioned earlier that still need a wide receiver? And then Austin Hooper, another guy, and it's tough to predict where tight ends go because just like Tyler Conklin and CJ Uzoma, like, did we really predict that they were both going to go to the Jets? Probably not. Last year, did we predict that Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith were both going to go to the Patriots? We probably didn't, right? So Austin Hooper being in the open market now, is his price tag going to be as high? I don't know. But again, he's one Colts, Chargers landing spot away from people starting to raise their eyebrows. And we can make jokes about it all we want because he was bad with Cleveland, but he was also like very, very good for fantasy with the Falcons. So a lot of guys that we covered today. Got a long list of what has happened, what has yet to happen. I'm pretty excited still to see some of these guys that are still floating out there. I think Deshaun Watson, most eyes are on him and what happens with him, because not only does it elevate things for fantasy for that specific team and the pass catchers on that team, but again, I think it's like a domino effect of these other teams saying, we didn't get Watson, now we have to go and get Baker or Jimmy Garoppolo, who I actually didn't mention either, or Matt Ryan, or one of these other guys that might be changing situations. So very interesting stuff. Maybe I'll have a part 3 next week sometime once things are more solidified. But if you were listening to this in your car, appreciate it. Live, appreciate it for sure. I have a pinned tweet on Twitter. I'm going to do a raffle on Friday. It's for a free Viridian Global t-shirt. If you go to their site, they have badass t-shirts. Every single team, a bunch of different players. It's going to be your choice, and all you have to do is follow the directions on the pinned tweet, and that is yours. Other than that, enjoy this time. This is exciting stuff. We should be excited for a bunch of news like we've had. We should be excited in our dynasty leagues, and this is a good reason if you don't play dynasty that you should be playing dynasty, because if you do, now is the time people are making moves in their leagues based off of these transactions. And again, fun stuff. So appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you all soon.